What is some dark sh going on around the world right now that the public probably doesn't know about? Saudi Arabia sentencing to death people who refuse to move out of their homes so that they can build Neom, their new megacity, and their relatives being sentenced to multiple decades of prison time just for protesting or merely posting their support to the cause on social media. Edit, link to video. This was the cover feature in Bloomberg Businessweek a couple months back. Pretty interesting. Sounds absolutely insane. I think people have been desensitized to murder in Saudi Arabia. Those FRs will hang you for sneezing in the wrong direction. Western media is really good at keeping Saudi oppression hidden. I think we need a subreddit or news website dedicated to that kind of non-trending and barely known but actually very important news. Is there something like that out there? Randomititties has a decent spread. Me. Hey, good one. Had a nice chuckle. Opens link. WTF, you weren't kidding. It's a funny story, where world politics devolved into pure chaos when people realized the moderation team didn't actually moderate sh. So Randomititties became the new world politics and news hub. Funny how Reddit works. In Africa there is a very real and very extensive slave trade going on right now, to say nothing of the other probably 40 million living in bondage. It made me take more than a couple of moments to myself when I heard that there are likely more people in slavery today than there ever have been in history. More than 40 million people around the world were victims of modern slavery in 2016, including about 25 million in forced labor, and 15 million in forced marriages. If they all lived together in a single city, it would be one of the biggest cities in the world. Edit, people are bringing up a lot of good points. Notably, 1. World population has increased. It would be one of the biggest cities in the world. There's gotta be better comparisons that they can make. Like more than Canada or more than California or 38th largest country in the world or something. One of the largest cities just doesn't feel like it packs that big of a punch. 70% of the world's chocolate comes from West Africa. An estimated 1.5 million child slaves are engaged in chocolate production in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, alone, not counting Nigeria and Cameroon. From what I have heard from my Ghanaian Togolese history professor, the majority of these child slaves are in the Ivory Coast. This is due to the differences in the two countries' farming systems. In Côte d'Ivoire, most of the cocoa farms are large-scale, plantation-esque endeavors owned largely by external bodies, and worked on by local and foreign laborers. Conversely, most cocoa farms in Ghana, and most other crops, generally speaking, are owned by families. So, in Côte d'Ivoire, it is much easier for trafficking, extortion, and slavery to exist, thanks to the nature of these gigantic, externally owned farms. In Ghana, most of the farms are small enough to where the family itself is sufficient to work the land, thus making there little necessity for use of enforced labor. In Côte d'Ivoire, workers of all ages might receive some pay, but it's insufficient and much less than allotted for the work completed. Likewise, they are often promised education or housing, but in turn receive and are forcibly kept on farms. This is not to say similar circumstances aren't prevalent in Ghana, but that the majority of which are in neighboring Ivory Coast. Another similar issue to mention is that of slavery in the Middle East, largely in cities such as Dubai or Doha, where foreign workers, mostly Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani, are employed to work abroad, and upon arrival, receive less income and benefits than advertised. It is barely enough, if that, to survive, nonetheless to send remittances home or to leave the country, thus leaving them entrapped in their work and in the country. A similar issue is prevalent in Qatar, where workers are quite literally worked to death to complete a stadium that will host the World Cup in 2022. Like in Côte d'Ivoire, workers receive insufficient pay and little to no benefits, and frequently live in grossly subpar conditions. I recommended the Vice documentary The Megacity Secretly Built by Slaves in regards to slavery in Dubai. Likewise, I recommended The Dark Side of Chocolate for the child slavery issues in West Africa. Literature on the latter is extensive and well documented. For both, some might argue that this is not slavery, as living conditions are often acceptable and pay is there, even if only meager. But, this is still slavery nonetheless, though it does not exist in the exact form of chattel slavery that is commonly taught in Western, and others, education. It does not mean it isn't any less cruel or legitimate. When people are extorted, manipulated, exploited, and trafficked for labor and fiscal benefit, that is slavery. In the mid-2000s, a Nigerian friend of mine was tricked with a job offer in Dubai, which turned out to be way less of an attractive offer once he was there, which he then rejected. He was in line at the airport on his way home when they detained him on some BS charges, and despite the efforts of friends and family in Germany, me included, he ended up being housed in some gigantic container complex in the middle of the desert and bussed in to work construction every day, for no money, because his trial was pending. At first we had a small amount of interest in helping us get him out of there from an embassy or a former employer. But after around half a year of dead ends he lost access to the phone he was using to communicate with us, and no one in any official capacity in Dubai that we could get on the phone would admit he was there at all. No one has heard from him in almost 20 years now. Holy sh man. That's effing terrifying. Mass kidnapping of school children in Nigeria and other African nations, and the only ones talking about it since 2021 is UNICEF. Edit. Yikes, first time a comment broke 1K likes. Thanks for the love. For the record, I'm speaking from an American's perspective who spent the better part of a decade serving in Europe, Asia with the military, and can say for certain the only reason I'm aware of it is because of anti-human trafficking awareness the US Air Force talks about constantly. I work directly with NATO and listening to US AFRICOM talk about it daily, and yet you never hear about it in the mainstream American media. I live in northern Nigeria and kidnappings are so common. It's so common that most people in the north personally know at least one person that has been kidnapped before. They attack trains, military bases, airports, schools, rich people, poor people. They even set up roadblocks and kidnap people for hours, and the government is doing nothing about it. Are they kidnapping them to traffic them? No, the kidnappings are mostly done for ransom. I'm in Mexico right now. Indigenous children are being sold for RE in the state of Guerrero like pieces of meat. Government turns a blind eye and civilians are threatened by the cartel. It's messed up. Welcome to Mexico, and not only Guerrero. We can add Chiapas, Oaxaca, Tabasco, Veracruz, and Estado de Mexico. Unfortunately, the country is some sort of narco state. My old supervisor would joke that he bought me a vacation to Veracruz, as 98% of murders go unreported. Bacterial resistance to antibiotics is at an alarming level. There has already been instances of pan-antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. This can throw us back to the pre-antibiotic era, which will effectively mean catch an infection and die. No big pharma wants to invest in antibiotic research because of the huge R&D cost and relatively meager return. Although everyone agrees that we desperately need new antibiotics. Well, as soon as dying from infections becomes a rich people problem again, the interest will skyrocket. Check out a billionaire named Daryl Katz. He's currently dying of an antibiotic-resistant sinus infection. And the irony is he made his billions in the pharmacy business. Thanks for posting this so I could learn. How crazy. I started getting sinus, ear infections and a scalp condition about 34 years ago. Seems like a round of antibiotics helps for a bit sometimes, but then it comes back or doesn't really subside. That the vast majority of slavery still existing in the world right now is for agricultural purposes. And by slavery, I mean people owned by other people and forced to do work for no pay, as opposed to people doing what they need to do out of necessity and accepting what pittance they receive in return. And the produce is sold on the regular market, meaning that there is a non-zero chance that you have brought vegetables that were grown by literal slaves. Vegetables? Sure. But the most obvious answer is in the Middle East. Countries like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, etc. All of that infrastructure was built by foreign labor whose passports are confiscated. They're essentially stuck in those countries with harsh conditions and are treated as slaves unable to go home. Who the heck do you think built the stadiums for the Qatar World Cup starting next month? They didn't just build a stadium. Qatar built a whole effing city for the World Cup. They've had more than 6,500 migrant workers die there since the project started. Shame on the rulers of Qatar, but also big effing shame on FIFA for their willful ignorance about the horrible behavior of host nations. FIFA does a lot of shady sh. I think there was some list of disgusting things they've done being passed around Reddit a while back. Thanks for sharing all this, guys. I don't think I'm living past 50 now. I'm still scrolling and ruining my own day. For me it is night. My nightmares are bad enough. Fast fashion is a human rights and an environmental disaster. There are certain parts of the garment construction process that cannot be mechanized. So humans have to be involved in the production, and the vast majority of them are underpaid. Additionally, fast fashion, especially in women's clothing, isn't made to last. So the fabric and the actual construction is shoddy and the clothes wear out quickly. But fabric recycling is rarely available. So most of those clothes end up in a landfill. Natural fibers release greenhouse gases, ETA. This is an issue in landfills because organic materials decompose in an anaerobic environment in landfills versus an aerobic composting environment, which creates more main source as they decompose. And synthetics release chemicals into the water table. I have a degree in costume and we did a lot of work around sustainability because the fashion clothing industry is so harmful. The amount of water used to make fabrics is also very damaging. I love my field of work, but companies need to do better and we need to stop supporting shine. There's a documentary on All 4 where someone went undercover in a factory for Shine in China. What they uncovered is horrific. I sew for 8 hours a day on a wage just above minimum, and that's mentally draining. So for those ladies working 10 plus hours for pennies is disgraceful. Trust me, it's not just Shein either. Half your bougie brands? I've seen them being made in my garage as a kid by my adoptive mother, who was an immigrant scraping by to live her dream of raising a child. Van would show up. They'd barter the price for the job. She'd sew morning to night. Week or two later pickup happens, rinse and repeat. This is 90s Australia BTW. And still occurring. Yeah, I'm very aware of this. I refuse to buy from Dorothy Perkins now because the brand Arcadia brought them. They own Boohoo and were found to be doing some very dodgy SH with their wages and treatment of workers. Plus the clothing quality is awful. 9% of Eritrea's population is slaves. The prevalence of modern-day slavery is way more than people like to talk about. Eritrea is literally listed as the worst country in the world for human rights. That's not at all surprising. And how many people know that? Most people only know stuff about the major powers and the countries they are directly dealing with. How many times on the news has Eritrea appeared for you? How often is it brought up in conversation? People don't pay attention to the overwhelming majority of countries. There are legitimately people who think Africa, the entire continent, is a country, and it's not just that they weren't properly educated, it's just there is a lot of information in the world and most of it is not relevant to the average person's daily life. The most I've heard of Eritrea was someone wearing an Eritrea shirt. Behind every polished business facade is a hodgepodge of systems that are hacked together to service you. Data protection is second to revenue. All the networks and system engineers have the power to truly steal all your data. Worked at an insurance giant. Can confirm. An absolute mess. I also worked at an insurance giant. Can confirm. I was in claims. We needed to capture a 2-character data field. Cost to do so? $20 million. Why? They were running, then, 96 different financial programs. Inserted here and there in probably as many computer languages, many of which were lost. Off of their creaking 1967 IBM mainframe system. The IT guys would literally visit retirees, begging them to look through their garages, basements, and attics for any programming materials they had from, say, 1975. Because there was nobody who knew how to write in that language. It was literally, held together with spit and baling wire. And it was a multi-billion-dollar company, the failure of which would have had global repercussions. Teetering. Honestly, I was never so shocked, or shook, in my life. But hey, the executives all got their raises and bonuses and the stock price was great. We had a snazzy logo and snappy commercials. Ran into someone doing drywall. Older guy in his 60s or so a couple years back. We got talking and he mentioned was a programmer up until the dot-com bust and decided to take up a trade as he felt it was more stable. I asked him what languages he used and he said the main one was COBOL. I told him that every major financial institution in the US, plus the federal government, would instantly pay him 6 figures if he picked it back up again. Sure enough, a year later, he got a job making $180,000 or so because of his background in it. The clients of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell are still files, and still free, putting innocent children at risk. Crazy, not a single client of theirs has been charged. Not crazy at all considering their clients are all the government world leaders and famous people. I moved to Sydney 2 weeks ago, and can't believe how many public sides there are. It's almost every day someone KS themselves from jumping from a building or in front of a train. I catch the train almost every day and it feels like a matter of time before I see one happen myself. We're in a massive mental health crisis right now and it's extremely hard to get help. Jesus, didn't know this. Media doesn't report sides. It's to stop triggering copycats. In Adelaide, a chick tried to swan dive off a bridge into an oncoming train she missed and basically face planted the ground in the middle of our worksite. There are a lot of sides by train. Side by train is one of the SHTS sides you can go for. It fucking scars poor engineers for years to experience that. And yeah, I know that it's probably not the best vista if you see someone splatter themselves from the 40th floor down. But these poor lads have this extremely attention requiring and responsible, especially if it's passenger train carrying hundreds and hundreds of souls, jobs for which they need to train for years. And then, out of the gray, some $1 decides to end their lives by surprising you with their internals all across your locomotive. Yeah. How about hanging yourself on a swing set in a kindergarten just before it opens in the morning next time? $1. Note, if you are a journalist or reporter, I am begging you to please report this. There's a major CPAP recall that has affected half of the machines out there and there's no fix. People are literally dying because of this and the DOJ needs to step in. Patients don't wear their CPAP mask? They can die. If they do wear it, they are exposed to carcinogens and can lead to cancer. Ventilators affected as well. It's been over a year and Philips only wants to reimburse $50 for the machines. We have patients waiting months for a machine. The sleep world is affected, including our jobs and lawyers. No one is talking about it. The FDA recall is serious. I posted to a CPAP subreddit. Any updates about the lawsuit? Nope. I work in healthcare. Nothing. Though I did read an article, there's support that they want the Department of Justice and President Biden to intervene like they did with the formula. We have kids at the hospital I work at who stop breathing over 100 times per hour, having to wait weeks for a CPAP machine. Waiting weeks to breathe. It makes me so angry. Truck drivers required to wear a CPAP mask if they want to keep their CDL or else lose their job. People I see on death's door during sleep studies who need a CPAP machine but can't because even the sleep labs have to limit how many people we do titration studies on because we can't even get machines to test our patients. I wear a CPAP mask and they sent an email to me, as a patient, saying that they have no solution for the piece and I have to buy a new one but would only reimburse me $50 for the machine. Are you freaking kidding me, Philips? Yeah, I started to fill out Philips-like survey for the recall of the machine but realized it would take months for me to get a replacement. They just sent me their newer supplies like hose, mask, and filters. I have it severely and if I don't use my machine I have side effects next day. For anyone that finds this, know that you can just buy a CPAP for $400 or so from a variety of websites without insurance. And you don't need a prescription. The price submitted to insurance companies is $10,000 or more. Ridiculous. Women going missing from Indian reservations across some of the U.S. Many are young women and probably being used for trafficking. There are some interesting podcasts on the subject. Edit, Vancouver, BC. Y'all, I have no idea what's going on in Washington state. I live in Vancouver and every week there's a new poster for a missing Indigenous woman. Every single week, ever since the Highway of Tears scandal, there's been more and more Indigenous women disappearing. Last one I saw was 13 years old. 13 effing years old. No one talks about it. No one acknowledges it. Idle no more. The Indigenous women group who's been fighting for reparations is quite literally ignored by police unless they show up at a protest. That and the residential schools massacres are just the effing tip of the iceberg of our First Nations have been going through for 400 plus effing years. I'm from northern Manitoba and it's much of the same there. When I was in school, we would hear about girls maybe a few years older than us, or even the same age, just disappearing. Some dying from starlight tours. Or some just up and vanishing. Girls we all knew, who wouldn't just run away from their families. We would often have some drinks around a fire as teenagers just talking about how we knew these girls or how someone close to me has lost their auntie. Or grandma same way. So many Indigenous girls just vanishing. And the cops did and still do absolutely nothing. MIG is a human rights crisis. Statistically, Indigenous women are more likely to go missing than finish high school. That's a terrifying statistic. Most of my family friends are Indigenous. And I would be lying if I didn't say that I don't worry that every day. That might happen to my best friend, cousins, stepmother, and so on. The extent of fisheries and ocean life's collapse. Alaska just put the emergency brakes on its entire snow crab fishery as the numbers suddenly fell off a cliff. Same for many salmon species, wild fish, etc. Plenty of fish in the sea seems like an saying that will be true forever. But it won't be. I have seen estimates that there would just be no commercially viable fishing by 2048. We are scraping the bottom of the ocean and emptying it of life. I just watched A Life on Our Planet with David Attenborough and this gets touched on. Incredible doc with actionable changes we can make at the end. Couldn't recommend enough. What were the actionable changes? In America there are corporations such as BlackRock buying up tons of houses. Whole neighborhoods really. They're paying higher than asking price. They will then be permanently renting them out and it will further destroy the middle class working class. They will make middle class PPL permanent renters. And our politicians on both sides of the aisle are letting this happen because they take money from these corporations. Yep. We'll soon have entire neighborhoods built by builders and sold bulk to these rental corps. Unsustainable. How about state-level law enforcement stealing identifiable property out of evidence control to pay snitches with it? Source: I lost my career over exposing this practice and everyone involved was promoted. That's effed up. I'm sorry. Trafficking in Ukraine. How better to disappear young women and children than during wartime? They've been caught moving masses of people deep into Russia. Somalia is pretty much gone at this point, facing war and one of its worst famines in ages. It would be a miracle if they make it through. Not sure what you mean by make it through. People will survive. The country hasn't had any kind of structure for years, so it'll continue doing that. At this point Somalia is just what we call the land that borders Ethiopia. Funnily enough, as far as I know, the northern half of the country, Somaliland, pretty much has a functional government and state, and has been wanting independence and to shed the dysfunctional southern half for years. For some reason, nobody is willing to recognize or accept their independence and government. It pisses me off so much that the international community wants to stick to the status quo because if they recognized breakaway states, they might have to deal with the ones in their own countries. So much bloodshed could be avoided. Like the Sudanese civil war. If we just said hey these borders are terrible maybe we should redraw them.